Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi Christian University. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights, and each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. First up on our list of historical highlights for the week is Samuel Lee, who became the first officially appointed Methodist missionary to Australia when he arrived in Sydney on August 10, 1815. At the time, the colony of New South Wales was still young, populated by convicts, soldiers, settlers, and government officials. Religious life was limited, and many communities lacked regular Christian instruction. Lee immediately began preaching throughout the Sydney area, often traveling long distances on horseback to reach isolated settlers. He organized Methodist societies, established preaching stations, and encouraged lay leadership in places where ordained ministers were scarce. His ministry expanded beyond New South Wales, eventually reaching the indigenous Maori people of New Zealand, where he helped lay the foundation for Methodist missionary work that would continue for generations. Next up on our list, and the subject of our deep dive, is Hippolytus of Rome, remembered as one of the most important defenders of Christian orthodoxy during the early 3rd century. Gnostic teachers were spreading ideas that denied essential biblical truths, and Hippolytus wrote extensively to expose their errors and defend the apostolic faith. His most famous work, the Refutation of All Heresies, carefully examined and challenged many of the false teachings that threatened the early church. Hippolytus's theological credentials were exceptional. He was taught by Irenaeus of Lyon, who had been taught by Polycarp of Smyrna, who had been taught by the Apostle John. This direct chain of discipleship gave Hippolytus a unique connection to the apostolic generation and strengthened the authority of his defense of biblical doctrine. On August 13, 236 AD, he was martyred during the persecution under the Roman Emperor Maximinus Thrax. His steadfast defense of the Christian faith and his willingness to suffer for Christ led the early church to honor him as a saint and as one of its most influential theologians. Last up on our list of historical highlights for the week is Cologne Cathedral in Cologne, Germany. Designed to inspire awe through its soaring architecture, stained glass windows, and twin spires, the cathedral was intended to be a fitting shrine for one of medieval Christianity's most treasured relics, the traditional remains believed to be that of the Three Magi. Construction began on August 14, 1248, and progressed steadily for more than 2 centuries, before work largely ceased due to financial constraints and changing architectural tastes. The unfinished cathedral stood with a construction crane atop one tower for nearly 400 years, becoming one of Europe's most recognizable unfinished landmarks. During the 19th century, renewed interest in Germany's medieval heritage led to construction resuming in 1842 using the original medieval plans. The cathedral was finally completed in 1880, more than 632 years after construction began. Today, Cologne Cathedral is Germany's most visited landmark, welcoming millions of visitors each year. Designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it remains the seat of the Archbishop of Cologne and stands as one of the finest surviving examples of Gothic architecture in the world. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, founder and director of the Center for Christian History, talks with the Reverend Dr. Alistair Stewart of Codrington College about Hippolytus of Rome.
Hey, what about a guy who sometimes is called the first anti-pope? Is that a real thing? What does that mean? Who is that? How do church fathers and those that are really just as the church is really getting its sea legs, so to speak, figure out kind of how do we do church? How do we do doctrine? How do we do these things? And as I tell students sometimes, Jesus didn't give the 12 apostles a 3-ring binder and say, this is exactly the way it's going to roll out, right? So part of that is understanding more about people like Hippolytus, who we are going to focus on for this conversation. We are using the date of his martyrdom, and we're really glad to have Dr. Alistair Stewart, who is with us, who is not only an Anglican priest, but also is a a professor at Codrington College and taking one for the team and doing that in Barbados, nonetheless. So, Dr.
Absolutely.
Stewart, thank you so much for spending time with us.
Yes, somebody has to do it, really. Just so you know, Codrington College is the provincial seminary for the church in the province of the West Indies. It also serves as the theology department of the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. So,
okay, fantastic. Okay.
if anyone's interested to come and do a doctorate with me in Barbados, there we go. That can be done through the auspices of the University
That's
of the West
fantastic.
Indies.
No.
Yeah.
We'll put that into the show notes as well. So, tell us really, okay, this guy Hippolytus. I mean, who was he? Where did he come from? How did he get to that? We're talking about him some 2,000 years later.
Right. Well, let's do the easy bit first. Who was he? Well, where did he come from? Probably somewhere in what is now Turkey, although that's probably guesswork. And I say that because one of the texts which is under his name is a book called Against Noetus, and it's all about a discussion regarding Trinitarian theology, which takes place in Smyrna, which is nowadays Izmir, but Smyrna is probably known as one of the places to which Ignatius of Antioch stayed, and I think letter also from the Seer of Revelation to the church of Smyrna. So he is probably from that area of Asia Minor originally, but he is known to be active in Rome. And the only real kind of clue to his name and date, apart from the fact that he was probably of Asian origin. I say Asia because that's what Turkey was called at the time. It was the Roman province of Asia. So when I'm saying Asian, don't think he was Chinese, but or South Indian, but from, as I say, from Turkey. But I mean, say he's in Rome, and of course the Roman Church is an interesting thing. I always tell the tale of, from my experience, to give an idea of what the Roman Church would have been like, of visiting a church to preach, and the rector was a graduate of our college, Codrington College. We used the West Indian prayer book and the West Indian hymn book, and then afterwards we went to lunch where we had ham and salad and frying fish, you see, and then another couple of colleagues who were also graduates of our college dropped in. And the question is, where was I? And everybody can say, well, you were in the West Indies, surely. And the answer is no, I was in Brooklyn. In an entirely kind of West Indian Anglican congregation and church. So Roman Christianity was very much like that. It was there were definite ethnic bases to the kind of different churches. So Hippolytus, being Greek-speaking, being from Asia, nonetheless would belong within a Roman ecclesial context.
Okay.
First Latin-speaking, if you could call him Bishop of Rome, and that's controversial, would have been Victor, who is possibly African or possibly Spanish. But the first Latin-speaking leading presbyter or Bishop of Rome, and that's at the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd. So the one kind of anchor then into history we have is a thing called the Liberian Catalogue. And that's a kind of a peculiar mixture of all kinds of things, including lists of popes and bits of history, and it was compiled in the 4th century. But it records, this is the point, that on the 13th of August, 235, Pontianus, the bishop, and Hippolytus, the presbyter, were martyred. Now, that in itself sounds fairly innocent, but what it's telling us is that at that point, the Hippolytus and Pontianus recognized each other as bishop and as presbyter.
Okay, interesting.
Now that's the key point. That's what's established then. So 235 is really the date at which you can say we have a Bishop of Rome. Around that point, that's the first time there's a kind of recognized Bishop of Rome. Now, of course, there would have been multiple bishops earlier on. This is a key point that I think people struggle with. That when we hear the word bishop, we think of somebody with a whole, sitting in a cathedral in a chair or surrounded by presbyters who are all off priests in their various parishes, all of whom, as it were, are working to the bishop. He's supervising a group, a number of priests. A bishop in the 1st and 2nd century was what we would probably call a rector or a parish priest. Who the presbyters were, well, you didn't even necessarily have any presbyters. That's the first point. Mm-hmm. He would have been the Eucharistic celebrant, the baptism, he would have celebrated every baptism, offered every Eucharist, being the kind of, the whole kind of the church, assisted maybe by some deacons.
Okay.
Now, in some churches, you also have presbyters, but it's not clear what they were. Probably something like what in Anglican terms you'd call a vestry, or in a Roman Catholic Church, the pastoral council, as it were, senior men who may well support him or advise him, or rather like a board of trustees in a charity. But
or maybe like a group of elders or a group of deacons or something that might be
not deacons. Deacons are something else, but elders.
Deacons. Yeah. Okay.
I wouldn't call it. I suppose in the Baptist Church, I think deacons probably function, but deacons were liturgical assistants and worked directly to the bishop, whereas the bishop of anyone worked to the elders, as it were.
Right.
They were kind of, as it were, the supervisory body, even though he had the day-to-day management.
Interesting. Okay.
So you have multiple, so earlier on to say that Hippolytus was a bishop and Callistos was a bishop, and I mentioned Callistos because can we do any screen sharing here?
Sure. I think we can.
And I mentioned Callistos because there was a falling out between a character who may have been Hippolytus, and this is where it gets very confused and complicated. A character who may have been Hippolytus and Callistos, who was a leading bishop within Rome. So I think what's happening is that although we start out where every church has a bishop, we begin to get points, as it were, where, as it were, daughter churches are splitting off. The federation of churches, because the churches were originally kind of quite closely, they'd federate, they'd talk to each other. So, I mean, in political terms, you think of the relationship between in America, the Federation, the United States, and the individual states. And I know there's always tension between, states' rights and federal oversight. In Europe, the EU again, is it what the Germans call a Bundesstaat, which is a state made up of federated individual, or a Staatenbund, which is a federation of individual independent states. So the church, as it were, I think goes from being a Staatenbund fairly early on, where you have individual churches entirely self-governing with their own bishops, and they are in conversation with each other. They, as it were, police the limits of communion. It's especially well evidenced in Rome, where, and to a point where, as it were, the federation becomes more important than the individual churches. But there's a lot of friction between somebody who I think was one of the members at the Hippolytean school. Now, I think the dates don't work for it to be the same Hippolytus that was martyred. But I think what we have here is succession within a school. And that's in a book called The Refutation of All Heresies, which is in itself a fascinating book. But he bangs on at great length about what a terrible person this Callistos is, and how lax he is, and how he thinks he's bigger than he ought to be. So there's clearly tension going on within the Roman Federation. Now, I then let me see if we can point to this guy. Right, it's going to work. Let me open my picture. There's a guy called Döllinger. I've got a picture of him here. who writes a book in the 19th century, having established, it's Dollinger who identifies Hippolytus with the author of the Refutation, but then goes on to argue that he was as effectively the anti-pope. Now, I think the issue for this, of course, is that there was no pope for him to be anti, if this makes sense.
At that time period, right?
But Dollinger is, here we go now, I'll show you a picture of Dollinger. There he is. And Dollinger is a Roman Catholic priest. Now, it becomes exceptionally interesting because Dollinger is opponent of papal infallibility in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, he never actually leaves the Roman Catholic Church, but he is effectively suspended and is courted by those who are trying to, as it were, form the old Catholic communion, which eventually did come about in Bavaria. So I think he sort of sees Hippolytus, and this is where, kind of ecclesiastical politics, church concerns, regular politics kind of overlap, what you would hope would be the disinterested study of church history, but of course it's never quite so disinterested. Right. So it's Dollinger who draws this picture of Hippolytus as it were, an anti-pope, a sort of secondary pope within Rome. And of course it's still there in library catalogues.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with the Reverend Dr. Alistair Stewart by clicking the View Full Interviews button on the podcast page of centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi Christian University in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and follow the Center for Christian History on Facebook and Instagram. Our next podcast episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.